welcome back. I hope you've all had a chance to get some restorative food, rest, whatever it was that you needed. Jeff, did you take care of your body politic?
I did. I had some lovely shrimp wonton ramen.
Well, fantastic. I had coffee.
Oh, I did the coffee earlier.
Oh, look at that. You sure did. Jeff, would it be okay if I started you out with a question that was on the in the chat?
Sure.
Okay, we have Miriam asked, Miriam Zitlow, one of our advisory board members. First of all, I want to welcome and thank all of our advisory board members here who are joining us today. I know Abby is with us, Joe is with us. Please forgive me if I'm missing anyone. Sam Jackson is with us, Jerry Everhart, Miriam, and others. But great work, and I'll if I've missed anyone, they know who they are, and I certainly will call them out later. But thank you to our advisory board. Let me get right to Miriam's question. Much of the reference in the discussion, well, just about some of the unfamiliar things, but the comment on that the definition of justice is in relation to who owns what is noteworthy. And with that in mind, I think it'll be interesting to hear about the environmental justice, particularly who owns the land, the water, and the air in the present generation or the future generation. And based on who say so, the original inhabitants or the conquerors. What about the plants and the non-human animals? What ownership do they have? Maybe that's a way we can kick off our next section, but there it is. I've posed the question to you, and then you'll take it wherever you go. Thank you, Miriam. It is an excellent question.
So to start with that question, the phrase I've been using is what's rightfully whose, and it's not clear that that's ownership. So respect might be due to you. That might be something that's rightfully yours, but you don't own respect. So I want to keep those a little bit separate. So to the question, do animals have a right to life, is one of the questions that vegans answer and vegetarians answer if it's a question of justice affirmatively. So you might think that sentient beings, what's rightfully theirs is the resistance to killing them, except in self-defense, let's say. For trees, you might think, well, different people think different things, and you could be a panpsychist and think trees are sentient too, but an alternative view could be that future generations have a right to our due concern and care, and part of their thriving is having a natural world. So you might think preserving nature in various ways is rightfully someone's, but not rightfully the trees. And it might be rightfully someone's, but not because they own the trees. Matter of fact, we might preserve nature precisely by making it a public good not owned by anybody. So I want to press against putting rightfully who's too close to ownership. And I want to remark that ownership is sometimes something people enjoy that's not rightfully theirs. So, and that would be the case in the slavery. You might say, look, there's no question that in the antebellum South, slave owners own the slaves by all the standards of ownership. It's just that they didn't have a right to own them because the slaves had a right to their freedom that was being abridged in the property relationship. Katie.
I'm curious if Socrates ever addressed, what today we call the tragedy of the commons, but the idea of if everyone owns everything in common, whose responsibility is it to care for it if it's not mine?
Right.
Did he address that at all?
He did not. But it's a really important idea and argument for giving ownership to people in various ways. And I certainly think his argument for a market economy, if not sensitive specifically to the tragedy of the commons was sensitive to the ways in which, for most people, owning things is tightly tied to their incentives. So I wanted to remark quickly on something that Susanna mentioned, but Susanna's not here. But I wanted to explain why I switch between he and her pretty consistently. It's not arbitrary, and it's not, I think, what did she think it was? Overcorrect. So I don't believe he is a neutral pronoun in fact. And so when I speak, I try always either to use generics, which are plural, or different examples with people of the different genders. And it's just because I think in English in America, talk of he too quickly evokes not either possibility, but a particular gendered person. So I just like to balance it. And so it may be overcorrecting. I'll argue with people about that, but it's not a knee-jerk correction. It's a principled view of how if only he were neutral, then it would work. But all the evidence is it's too gendered to work as a neutral thing, whereas they and them works neutrally. But it offends my sense of English to call a single person a they or them. So not that my sense of English should be too highly privileged, but the reason I go for either plurals or people's preferred pronouns or individual but gendered pronouns is that. Malcolm. Your hand's up, Malcolm?
Yeah, your discussion, if I understood it, is that Plato and Socrates had this view that government and a just city has to do with the right people being in the right places. And that, so you could say, well, maybe some of our problems with our governments are that we're electing the wrong kinds of people. If we had the right kinds of people, it might be, we might not have those. Now, this sort of post-Enlightenment view is that people have these defects and you can develop a system that, where the system controls these defects in people, and you can have a just system with unjust people. And like somebody like Rawls would say, well, look, if anybody knows where their interest lies, they're going to be influenced. So you have to have this veil of ignorance, So, I mean, if this whole argument is based on, the just city and or the just polity or whatever, and we know, and everything we're doing currently is no longer based on that concept, then how do we take this idea of he's using that as a basis for personal justice, but if we no longer really accept those ideas about what a just city or polity is, how do we use those for personal justice now?
Okay, let me start with the end. That's a really nice question. You really do have to ask yourself, is he right about the nature of justice? And it is his view that when we're thinking about states, the nature of justice is a matter of each part of the state playing its proper role. And that's possible only when people with the relevant capacities are in those roles. So his diagnosis of a state failing to be less than ideal by becoming unjust is that the wrong people got into the positions that are relevant. A common view is that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the alternatives. And what's good about democracy is it substitutes structural protections for confidence in individual occupants of roles. So by making people have to be re-elected constantly, by balancing powers, we find a way to address the inevitable failure of people in their positions. So that's one sort of view about what's wrong with Socrates, it's not that he's got justice wrong, but he's got the wrong theory of how to get the parts to play their proper role. That shouldn't be by getting the right people in the positions, but creating incentives around the positions that will get them to do the right thing. There'd still be issues of they can't be too ignorant or too oblivious to getting reelected or too malevolent, because no matter what the protections, a whole lot of damage can be done very, very quickly when you're in power. But so one issue to ask yourself is the ideal state one where somehow we manage to get the right people in the right positions? And if you think that's right, you might think, but how you get them there, the best way is a structural solution, not a individual choice solution, not a nature of the individual solution. It's worth noting the difference between that and Rawls and the veil of ignorance. And let me just, a lot of people I'm assuming don't know about Rawls here, but the basic idea is if you want to figure out what the rules of justice are that determine what's rightfully whose, here's a good way to think about it. You want people to be impartial. And the phrase, a cooperative venture for mutual gain, which captures the spirit of Rawls, of Plato and Socrates, is from Rawls. And Rawls was thinking the whole point of society is to make everyone better off. But if we settle on the principles, each knowing our own advantage, we're going to select principles that are in our favor. So, as a thought experiment, he said, imagine that you're behind a veil of ignorance, where you know general facts about being a human being, but you don't know which human being you're going to be. You don't know how athletic you'll be, how attractive you'll be, how smart you'll be, how rich your parents will be. You don't know any of that. And now, he thinks, it's your job to pick the rules of justice, which you will, he assumes, pick to maximize your odds of being well off against the background of you being really risk averse to terrible outcomes. Now, this idea, the veil of ignorance, comes directly from an economist named John Harsanyi. And Harsanyi thought what you would pick is the principle of utility for social structures, and justice demands we have the institutions that create the most benefits, and what's rightfully ours is determined by those institutions. Rawls thought that was wrong, and so he has this other trick for risk aversion, which changes the result of the choice. But the idea is the veil of ignorance is a way to model impartiality. It wasn't in Rawls a way of speaking to our selfishness. Matter of fact, Rawls assumed real people in life are often frequently moved by their conscience, by their sensitivity to what justice demands. So the well-functioning society, he thinks, depends on cultivating that capacity in people to not always be moved by their interest. But so the veil of ignorance is this theoretical device in treating the rules of justice as ones we would rationally choose if we were impartial. Democracy is a way of addressing selfishness by making people at risk for losing their positions. So there's a sort of important difference between those.
But does that mean that justice is different? You know, he had a society, and if justice in the person is based on the theory of what justice in the society is. So we have a different idea of what justice in the society is. So is his notion of personal justice going to be relevant to ours?
So that depends. So the first thing is, notice what, if I understood you, what you were calling into question is the psychological assumption that we could find people who psychologically are well suited to rule. who can put the interests of all over their own interests. And so that would lead you to be suspicious about the right mechanism being just pick the right people, because they'll inevitably be corrupted by the power. His theory of justice of the individual isn't that we have little people in our brains who are our rulers. So the relevant analogy, the corruption of the people in the society who make decisions, isn't relevant to the individual case. What's relevant is there a part of the Constitution that has its proper role to pass laws that are to the advantage of the whole? And he thinks the same is true of people. And then what you're arguing about, as I heard it, was I might agree that a just state passes the right laws. I just disagree that you can trust particular people to be influenced by anything other than their own interests. So your way of thinking that's embodied is mistaken.
Yeah,
We can come back to this.
Yeah, it just seems like we're already proceeding on an assumption that he thinks a person can be can balance these things within themselves and therefore be just. The fact of our whole setup of the society seems to suggest that we already gave up on that, and that's why we had to set it up this way, because we no longer believe that's possible.
So I think that's the question to ask yourself when it comes to people, is to ask, are people capable of asking and answering the question, what's best to do, and getting themselves to do it, even when they don't want to? Or are they able to ask the question, what's best to do, answer it, and judge that it's best to do something they have no desire to do and get themselves to do it? If you think that's possible, then his is still a live view, even if you think most people, when they're put in power, get easily corrupted. Because his claim isn't most people are just. His claim is this is what it would be for people to be just. And he thinks it's possible.
Thank you.
Okay, and we definitely come back to this. So let me, again, I want to cover for a little bit, a lot of ground quickly. Having
Jeff, I just
said
want to
what
let
he,
people know, I put a little link in there for Rawls if they want to be informed on who Rawls was from the Stanford Plato Encyclopedia.
So having said what he thinks a just state is and what he thinks a just person is and the ways in which they're analogous, he wonders about the alternative. What is it for a state to be unjust, and what is it for a person to be unjust? And the way he does this, because he thinks he has a whole lot of other things to say in political philosophy, is by identifying 5 types of state, 5 constitutions, or 5 ways a state could be constituted. One is the way we've already talked about. That's the aristocratic state. That's the state in which laws are passed in an informed way for the benefit of all. And the laws are enforced impartially, even-handedly, without avarice or racism or an overenjoyment of violence. And the market works as a basically free market where what's available and what's produced is limited to what's not bad for people. That's an aristocratic state. And he does think you do that by getting the right people, especially as the rulers and the guardians. He also thinks the right people as doctors is really important, but not as important. It doesn't result in the downfall of the whole city if some incompetent doctors are out there. It's just bad for some people. Same with teachers, same with house siding salespeople. Okay, so he says, so what are the alternatives? He's not saying these are the only alternatives, and he's not saying any real state is a pure example. But he thinks it's analytically useful to distinguish an aristocracy from a timocracy. A timocracy is a society in which somehow or other, what settles the question being asked by rulers is not what's best for the society as a whole, it's what would get us most honor and respect. The Spartans he's thinking about here. These are people concerned, the rulers or the society is passing legislation based on what other countries will think of them, or what the people in the country will think of the laws. And they're after being honored. Somehow people who are moved more by their spirit than their reason are passing the laws. And he says, that's bad. It's not horrible if you're lucky, because if you're lucky, honor is given to good decisions. And so people more concerned with honor than good decisions will still make good decisions, albeit to secure the honor. They said there's another type of city, oligarchies. These are cities in which, when you ask the question, why these laws, the right answer is they're really the laws they are because of an oversensitivity of the system to what will make the most money. This is a city run by people who are run by their appetite, not their spirit, not their reason, but their appetite is for money or the resources to get what you want. And these can be highly disciplined people, regimented people, but the answer to the question why these laws is financial gain, not the welfare of the whole city, not the honor that will be secured, but the GNP. Another type, worse still, he thinks. Yes, Paul.
Is there any distributive element to this? In other words, honor for whom, money for whom, etc. Exactly.
That's a superb question. My read of him is he mostly thinks the degradation in the society is happening among the rulers, and mostly they're concerned with honor or money for themselves. But you could imagine cities that are just concerned with having the highest GNP. That's what drives all the laws. And what's happened is the rulers mistake lots of money for being well off. Right. So he doesn't take a stand on it, but he seems to think what's happening is the wrong kind of people with the wrong focus, and it's mostly on them.
Thank you.
Worse, he thinks, are democracies, where the right story of which laws are put in place is they happen to be the most popular ones. So this is not representative democracy. This isn't a balance of power democracy with a judiciary. This is just, imagine a society where when you say, why these laws? It's because a majority of the people were in favor of them. Doesn't matter how ignorant they are, doesn't matter how selfish they are, doesn't matter how negligent they are. So I suspect a careful study of US history and attention to explanations of why particular laws in place will reveal of America, well, it's got a touch of aristocracy, a touch of democracy, a good dollop of oligarchy, and more than a little democracy in it. And his view is when there was all of those things other than aristocracy, what you're having are laws that aren't the laws that would be best for the whole city. They're laws that did something else that's worse for the whole city. And so a mistake, a real degradation. But even democracies can work well if the right things happen to be popular. It's just, you can't count on that. People, what's popular with people is too sensitive to Facebook and Instagram and whatever else. All of which Socrates roundly condemned. But it's in the Greek, it hasn't usually been translated, but Facebook is right there. Facia Libra, I think it was back then. As most of you know, I'm just kidding. Okay, The worst, he thinks, is a tyranny, where the laws that get passed are not only not the laws that would be best for the whole society, they're the laws that are positively bad for society. And this happens when tyrants, which can be a single person or it can be a body of people who care most about making happen the things that are worst for the city or bad for the city. So he gives us this 5 type, they're just stereotypes, they're just models of constitutions, ways societies might work. And he orders them from best to worst. And in the decline, he finds increasing injustice. Then he does the same with people. Same types. He thinks some people ask, answer, and act on the answer to the question, what would be the best thing for me to do? At least sometimes. Other people are spending a lot more time looking left and right and asking themselves, what would other people think of me? So while if they're surrounded by the right kind of people, they end up doing good things, they're doing it not because they've judged that it's good, they're doing it because they've judged that's what people will respect me for or honor me for or fear me because of. That is, they're concerned primarily, the democratically sold people, with what other people will think. And he thinks there are a lot of people like that. And then there are other people who are oligarchically sold, who the best explanation of how they make the decisions they make trace it to overweening concern with money. They might say, oh, darling, I love you. I care about you. You're the most important thing in my life. I love being with you more than anything. But every time a choice comes up, they choose to go do something that takes them away because it makes them more money. He thinks that's a very common trait in people. And then he thinks of the democratically sold people, the people who do what they feel like when they feel like it. When I talk about this to freshmen, I say, one way to be in college is to get really enthusiastic about one major, and then another major, and then another major, and then another major, and you're constantly flipping among things, not pausing to think, not just what do I happen to like right now, but what would it be good for me to major in? Or people eat until they're not hungry anymore, or they drink until they don't notice it anymore, and they're not even thinking, is this good for me to be doing? They're just feeling like it and doing it. And a tyrannically sold person, he thinks, is the person who's in the grip of desires they didn't need to have, and the satisfaction of which is bad for them. So he thinks pedophiles and alcoholics and drug addicts are good examples of tyrannically sold people. People who may well ask and answer the question, what's best for me to do? But they end up doing what satisfies their addiction or their strongest desire. Now, again, he thinks the best way to be is aristocratic and the worst is to be a timocrat. He thinks one is the most just, one is the least just. Before the next step, I just want to flag, he thinks when you ask and answer the question, what's good for me, often the answer is securing the honor of those around me, making some money, satisfying my desires. His view isn't that the ideal person is a person who abjures all of that. It's the person who indulges the desires that are good to indulge. My favorite case of me being aristocratically sold when it comes to desires is, as a graduate student in Pennsylvania, they have a horrible state liquor system where all the wine is sold through the state stores, and their purchasing decisions have nothing to do with the quality of the wine. And it's generally a pretty bad selection at outrageous prices. And somebody figured out a way to sell mixed cases of wine in the warehouse district And you could go and taste wine and learn the difference. And so my wife and I did that. Started developing a really good taste in wine because we thought that would be an enrichment in our life. And then we realized we can't possibly afford good taste in wine. And so we thought we need to defeat this. And so we developed a taste in coffee, which we figured we could afford pretty much the best coffee there is, exercise the pleasure of fine discriminations, and we started drinking Gallo bottled wine. This was reason saying, well, you can't possibly, if you build your taste in wine, you're going to undermine all sorts of other things in your life. Don't do it. But there's this good thing. Anyway, that's the true story of us thinking through the cultivation of desires for the enhancement of life. And certainly when you're surrounded by people whose judgment you trust, securing their honor is a huge reward and often a good guide. So there's no assumption here that a person ruled by reason isn't a living, loving, concerned member of regular society in this part of the theory at all. So now the question is, and then I'll go to you, Max. The question is, so why is one life, what's better about being aristocratically sold than the alternatives? There are clearly people who pick each of the other kinds of lives or find themselves in it. Why? What's so? And now we get to the crux of the argument. Oh, and Max is telling me that's the end of the seminar. Sorry. Okay.
No, I just wanted to say I thought it was interesting. I had Lloyd Kramer, hi Lloyd, our dear friend, director of Carolina Public Humanities, had commented, it's difficult to get most people to see the value of a broader common justice when the actions that would secure that justice appear to challenge or go against their own power or economic interests. And to the point of aristocracy, Abby asked, or how influences Plato then by his own aristocratic background? Tyrants in Athens often brought about reforms. And Paul again raises the question, you raised the question of whether and to what extent there is virtue in connoisseurship, a bottomless well. I think that was more of a in jest.
I'm not sure there's virtue in it, but there's certainly valuable pleasure. So to the other questions, I think it's interesting. I was co-teaching a course on the Republic in a juvenile detention center where he did the Republic and Aristotle, and some of the kids there at the end of the course said, so who do you admire more, Plato or Aristotle? And the person I was teaching it with said, well, I admire Plato because Plato was so willing to challenge authority. And that was so important, or actually Socrates was so willing to challenge authority. And that's so valuable, whereas Aristotle enjoyed the authority so much, he tended not to challenge it. He was always a compromise person. So I think despite his privilege, Socrates was someone who really distinguished power from having a right to the power you have, and was willing to question where a lot of people don't in the name of justice. And I do think that's a hugely admirable thing about him. Okay, where were we? Something about the value of justice or something? Okay, so he gives three arguments that, as I understand this, these are three arguments for thinking, for being aristocratically sold, or a state being aristocratic, being better than the alternatives. And these are meant to be, especially the first one, arguments that it's better independently of its consequences. But as you'll listen to the arguments, I think the first argument, which is the best, most influential argument to my mind, is directed to people already ruled by their reason. The second argument is directed at people who are mostly concerned with what experts think, and so the opinion of others. And the third is directed at people who are kind of preoccupied with pleasures and pains. So here's the first argument, the most influential argument. He asks us to think about what wealth really is and what freedom really is. And he offers us a view in light of which he thinks it becomes clear that being aristocratically sold is the only way you can be truly rich, and more importantly, the only way you can be genuinely free. All the other ways are impoverished and enslaved ways of living in the world. So, before I talk to you about that, I want to flag something I failed to flag before. Once you understand Socrates' definition of justice, it's being a person who asks and answers the question, what's best for me to do? You realize that it could be, in principle, just to break the law or just to steal. It would be if, but only if, reason tells you among the options, that's the best thing to do. So it's famous in psychological studies. One test of people is, would they, if their partner was terribly sick and desperately needed a drug to live and the pharmacy was closed, would you break into the pharmacy to get the drug to save your partner? And the thought is, when you think about the constrained circumstances, it's the best thing to do. But it involves stealing. But it's a test of moral sophistication that you don't just say, oh, it's stealing, it's wrong. So Socrates is committed to the possibility that sometimes breaking the law, sometimes stealing, sometimes lying might be required by justice. You can't tell till you ask what's best. And you actually get a good answer to it. Now, it could be that stealing is always worse than the alternatives, or lying is always worse than the alternatives. But that's a discovery. You don't know just by knowing it's lying or stealing that it's not demanded by justice. So he gives a kind of deeper explanation of the nature of justice than you might have if you thought, I know what justice is. Keeping your promises, respecting people's property, and not lying. Socrates says those usually are demanded by justice, but they're not the same thing as justice. He's going to do the same with wealth and freedom. You might think wealth is a matter of how many resources you have, how much money you have, how much power you have to get things. He says, but that's confused. If in using that power, you can't get anything that's good because you're no good at judging what's good to get, you're not wealthy. And the example I think of are the possible countries, actual countries, that have incredible resources in the ground. But the resources, when they're extracted and turned into money, aren't used for the welfare of the whole city or the whole country. They're used just for the powerful. That's a city that's impoverished, but it has a huge amount of resources. And what makes it impoverished is its inability, due to its constitution, to use those resources for the good of the whole. Same is true of a person. And I think of Elvis Presley here myself, incredibly lucky with resources, loved, admired, wealthy, talented, but so scared he can't go out of his house, so unable to trust those around him, he lives in fear, so addicted to drugs and peanut butter sandwiches that he destroys his health. There's a passage in the Republic where he describes the life of a tyrannically sold person who's unlucky enough not to be governed by other people. And it's practically a description of Elvis's life towards the end of it. And you think it's a mistake to think that at the end of his life, he was wealthy, not because he didn't have resources, but he didn't have the power to use the resources for anything good in his life, any way to enhance his life. So Socrates' view is wealth is the power to use resources to secure what's good. And that's only available to those who are actually thinking about what's good and successfully identifying it and pursuing it. So he thinks aristocratically sold people are the only people capable of true wealth, and the others are only capable of having shiny things, baubles, and toys, and their life isn't enriched unless they can come to start thinking about the value of what they have. That's one argument. The other argument, this is the really influential one, is you might think being free is being in a room where you can get out, not being in chains, not being physically restricted. He thinks that's really not freedom if how you use the lack of restriction is governed by what other people will think, or by what they'll pay you for, or by your appetites, or by an especially bad appetite that's bad for you to satisfy. He thinks of timocratically sold people, they're not controlling their choices, they've handed their choices off to what other people's opinions are. And the oligarchically sold people aren't in control of their choices. They settle what they'll do by asking, what will other people pay me to do? And the democratically sold people aren't free because their choices are determined by their appetites. Which ones are stronger? And the tyrannically sold people are especially pitiful because they're as fully enslaved to those appetites that are bad for them to satisfy. Whereas democratically sold people often want things that are perfectly fine for them to get. It's a fluke, but they want to eat. That's an important thing. You get a certain drug addiction, you stop eating. So his view is, once you understand justice as the capacity, the exercise capacity to rule by reason, you'll see it's the only way to be free. That's, in essence, what it is to be free. What's good about it isn't, as a consequence, you're free. Ruling by reason is what it is to be a free person. To be any of the other ways is to lose your autonomy. That's his first argument. For those of you who've read Kant, this is the argument that inspired Kant's groundwork. That's one argument. Second argument. Yes, Malcolm.
I mean, that's kind of a argument against the market economy, right? Because basically you can say, oh, I'm free as an American, but basically you have to make yourself into whatever the market is looking for to survive. So you can say, yeah, I'm free, but I mean, we have a system where, yeah, you're free to get fired unless you do, what the market is looking for that day. I mean, and so you can say, so it is an aristocratic view because you have to have a certain amount of money and power to exercise those judgments.
Or that would be one way you might think that. An alternative way is you might say any decent society would provide a safety net so that the choice of employment is governed not by the need to live, but by the discovery of what you can do productively for the society. That's his image, at least. So he gives this argument against the accumulation of wealth and the suffering of too much poverty. And he says any well-run state will recognize you have to have a cap on both. He doesn't think we ought to have communism or socialism, but he thinks we should have a safety net and we should have progressive tax in effect. Because he thinks unrestricted wealth accumulation creates indolence and abuse, and unmaintained minimums creates suffering and enslavement. As you say, market enslavement. So right now we're having this argument, on the one hand, so they're empirical debate. Does the current COVID payments reduce the supply of willing workers? And there's a lot of debate about that. Let's suppose it does. Well, then there's an argument, of course, to eliminate the subsidies to generate the employment. But then you have to ask, what are the terms of the willingness to take this employment? And a just state will pay attention to that, just as you suggested, Malcolm. Alternatively, it might turn out that it doesn't have that impact. And you might still think, but people don't need it because there is the ability for them to freely choose among so many jobs. Or you might argue they do need it because the only choices alternatively are to suffer in ways that aren't their own fault. So I'm with you in thinking a really relevant worry, given this notion of autonomy, is our market arrangements where you're forced to pay attention to what other people pay and make your decisions accordingly, are those infringements of freedom rather than the opportunity for freedom? I think that's a real question. But I think there's a real way to be very pro-market and pro-autonomy in his sense, where you make sure the society is set up so that the answer to the person's question, is this good for me to be doing, is yes, it is, independently of the only alternative being death.
Thank you.
Yeah, Paul.
In this mode of thinking, is he placing freedom as sort of the highest good, as a first principle? Because obviously there's a valuation here. It's better to be free than to just be rich. It's better to be free than to just be popular. Psychologically, one could debate whether that's in fact the case. But I just wanted you to address that.
So first thing is, you could end up thinking, you're absolutely right in what you say, but you could end up thinking against him, freedom's really good in itself, but it's outweighed by other things. And the real challenge here is, you think justice is good in itself, not just for its consequences. What's so good about it? He's now telling you. On the assumption that freedom is good, I'll tell you what's good about it. It's the only way you're genuinely free. That answer is compatible with saying, okay, I see, being just is good because it's the way you're free, but I really want fast cars, and I can't get fast cars if I don't. They're really good too. But you're right. He actually thinks it's so valuable that it's not worth sacrificing for anything else. That's why he took the poison rather than escape, because there's just nothing on offer that overbalanced your autonomy once you give it up. So he is assuming of his audience that they think freedom is valuable for its own sake. On that assumption, the contribution is, and I'll tell you what, you only have it when you're ruled by reason. And moreover, you don't have it because reason, being ruled by reason, produces it down the road as a consequence. No. Being guided by your own reason is what it is to be a free person. So the assumption you have to accept, the two assumptions are that freedom is good, and it's good not just for its consequences, it's good in itself.
And just one step further, I mean, in this instance, this is what I'm hearing is not a radical sense of freedom in the sense that it's not subject to external forces, but it's the ability to, the desire and the ability to make choices.
Yeah. Right. And to make choices on a certain basis.
Right.
So that's the fundamental notion of freedom for him. Okay, the second argument, which, oh yes, John, is your hand up?
Well,
Yeah.
well, and I don't want to interrupt your train of thought, but I know that our original, and this may be the end question, you can bury it and come back to it in 5 minutes, since I know we don't have much time left. The original argument was, why be a just person? And there were lots of cogent arguments given, it's all consequential. And the question that Socrates wanted to push throughout this whole thing was, why do it for its own sake? And I want to be sure that we come down with his definitive thing. And I think it came down to the tyrant. The perfect tyrant can get anything he wants whenever he wants, but that person not only won't be just, but he won't be happy either, because he'll continue to demand stuff, and that will make him an unhappy person. And I'd like for you to tie that into justice somehow before we end this seminar, because I think that's the critical question. I want to know that Socrates is right.
Okay, so it's very important to keep in mind that what's getting translated as happiness here is a translation of eudaimonia,
Which is
And-
Aristotle's thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
and
Right.
that's a matter of thriving.
Okay.
And they share the view that you don't count as thriving based on how you feel, which our notion of happiness is much more bound with how you feel. So for instance, if you live your whole life believing you're loved and admired, and have you guys seen The Truman Show? I sort of recommend it. It's, I won't give it away, but this is a guy whose whole life has been spent in a TV show where everyone around him is an actor. His father, his mother, they're all actors, his best friend. Aristotle and Socrates' view is he's led his life so far with no true friends, no genuine love, though he felt like he had it all, and for a while. They think he's not happy at all because he doesn't have these valuable things he thought he had in his life. So whether your life is happy depends on what actually the world is like and whether you've got in your life the good things. So that's a problem with the translation and with Reeves' interpretation of what's going on. I think the key argument, the one he mostly runs with, is assumption. Freedom is valuable for its own sake. It's also valuable for its consequences, but it's valuable for its own sake. And you can't be free without being just. But you might think, oh, I know what's going on here. Justice is a necessary condition for getting to be free. And what's good about being justice is it has freedom as a consequence.
Yeah.
But Socrates, I think, doesn't think that. He thinks being just is what it is to be a free person. So for instance, imagine someone asked me, what's so good about Clark Kent? And my answer is, he's Superman. And you say, so what are you saying? Are you telling me Superman only shows up when Clark Kent shows up, and a necessary condition for getting Superman is having Clark Kent. And I say, well, he is a necessary condition, but not because Clark Kent causes Superman to come. Clark Kent and Superman, surprise, are one and the same person. That's what's going on here. Being truly free and being a just person are, surprise, one and the same thing. Justice isn't obeying the laws. Justice isn't never telling a lie. It's a matter of successfully making your decisions and acting accordingly by figuring out what's the best thing to do. And tell you what, freedom isn't just having nobody restrict you. You can be totally enslaved, even if you're as rich as Croesus, as they say, if you can't use your powers to pursue what you judge to be good. And surprise, those are the same thing. Now, if that's right, it means something incredibly valuable in a human life is not available to the person who's not just. And so that means they don't enjoy eudaimonia. Not they're not feeling good, not that the drug addict with a limitless cost-free supply of crack cocaine isn't happy. Maybe they're happy, but their whole life is spent not accomplishing anything worthwhile.
Mhm.
That's the picture here. So it's not ultimately a psychological happiness that's what's security. It's something valuable in a human life. And he thinks autonomy is eminent or maybe preeminent among those things. So that's, and I think we get that by the end of this first argument.
Okay.
And I'm at least hugely myself tempted by this answer, though there are all sorts of things to worry about. But I think there's a lot both in his account of justice and his account of freedom that rewards a lot more thought. I'll put it that way. But let me quickly, just checking the time, give you the next two arguments because there are cool insights in them, even though I think neither comes close to showing that justice is good for its own sake. The first argument goes like this. Truth be told, if you go around and ask people, how should I make my decisions? In essence, you ask them, what kind of life should I lead? What should I devote myself to? You face an incredible cacophony of advice. Turns out most people tend to recommend the life they've been leading. So a person who's joined the military and devoted their lives, people who've devoted their lives to the military will say, sacrifice yourself for something greater, for honor, for your country. Do whatever you have to do for that. They'll recommend the democratic life. And people who've devoted themselves to making money will tend to advise people, don't be a knucklehead, pointed head intellectual, waste your time thinking about ideas, and certainly don't join the army and risk your life for not much more than a little trinket of a Purple Heart. Go out there and make a difference in the world, make some money. That's what's worth doing. Still, other people say, oh, come on, man, chill out, go with the flow. Do what you feel like doing. All the rest is a waste. Just live your life moment by moment. And the tyrant will say, you don't know anything till you've tried this. This is really the best life. Now, it's psychologically, actually, I think that's very rarely what people who are tyrannically sold say. But the point is, you get a whole lot of advice from a whole lot of people. What does a smart person do? They ask themselves, who's a competent judge? That's not just for what kind of life to lead, but what restaurant to go to, what movie to go to, what country to visit, what airline to fly. Different people recommend different things. And you say, God, I wonder who knows what they're talking about. He says, well, here's some things that better be true of them. They better have the relevant experience. If somebody's recommending a restaurant and they haven't eaten there, ignore them. But having the relevant experience isn't enough. They have to be able to learn the value of the restaurant, how good it is, from their experience. If all they ever eat are hot dogs with relish and chili, and it's a restaurant that doesn't specialize in hot dogs, they can't learn from their experience because it's too narrow. They went to the restaurant, they didn't try all the dishes. But also the people you really should listen to are the people who can have the relevant experience, they can learn from their experience, and they can learn from the experience of others through discussion and dialogue. So he gives generic characterization of who the competent judges are, which I think is very insightful. And then he does something very dubious. He says, instead of 5 types of people, let's divide people into ruled by reason, ruled by spirit, ruled by appetite. They each recommend their own way of living, but the people who've lived their whole life based on appetite, they don't even know what it's like to be devoted to honor or truth and goodness. So they're not competent. And the people ruled by spirit, well, they've known appetites, but they've never really known the value of being ruled by reason. So you know who the only competent judges are? The philosophers, because they've experienced it all. Matter of fact, in addition to the relevant experience, they're the only ones who can use their reason to draw from it the right conclusions. And they're the ones who are good at talking to other people. So believe us, the philosophers. And guess what we tell you? Philosophical life is the best life. It's a little bit like asking your brain what the most important organ in the body is. It's going to tell you the brain. I mean, look who's talking. Philosophy. So this is an argument that says when you're in doubt about something, it's not stupid to go ask competent judges. And there are context-free criteria for who counts as a competent judge. So you can, instead of trying to get the right answer yourself, you can get an answer to an easier question. Whose judgment should I trust? And if that's really easier and they all agree, then you have some reason to believe what they recommend. So that's the second argument. As I've implied, I'm not a real fan of this, except for the notion of appealing to competent judges is a good way of learning things. It just tends to not let you understand so much what you've learned. So what they say is, my life is best, and they may say, oh, because you're free. But until you follow the argument of what freedom is and why they're connected, you don't really understand. The third argument is an argument that starts this way. You agree, don't you? There's such a thing as a pleasant experience. Everyone agrees. How about a painful experience? Yeah, people agree. And do you agree there's something that's neither, something that's in between? It's neither pleasant nor painful? People agree. He says, here's how you should understand human appetites. It's the painful felt absence of something. That's what an appetite is. And when you have appetites and you satisfy them, you get rid of that painful feeling. So you move from pain up. But it's a mistake to think every time you move up from pain, you move up to something positively good or pleasant. All you've done is move from bad and painful in some cases, to neutral. A person who's living her life just asking what will satisfy this appetite is moving from below to the middle, and then immediately noticing another absence that's painful, moving back down and coming back up, constantly going back and forth. Now, I'm going to see if I can find a passage I love. Oh, this is the wrong edition for me to do it. I can paraphrase it. Here's the alternative. A person who asks what's really good is not paying attention to the felt pain, what's true pleasure. They're using their reason. And he says, the people who are governed by their desires spend their lives feeding, fattening, and fornicating, keeping their heads down like cows in the field, constantly butting horns to try to outdo the other, to get more of what really isn't good or of value in life. They fight and they go to war, but they never look up asking what's really worthwhile in life. They're never picking their heads up and wondering what's positively good, as opposed to an alleviation of something bad. That's the life of people who are stuck paying constant attention to what other people think, what they'll pay them for, or what their desires are urging them to do. So the idea is, if there's bad, neutral, and good, human nature is such that it focuses on getting rid of the bad and doesn't really set itself to securing, accomplishing, or enjoying what's positively good. Now, I think this is not fully true of human nature, but I love the feeding, fattening, and fornicating with their heads constantly lowered, butting horns, simply trying to outdo each other. I think that fits a whole lot of people's lives. And very sadly. And I think it's because they don't sort of pause and get out of the constant pressure of the rat race to figure out what's really worthwhile here. What should I be giving up? They just pay attention to what they don't have. So that's the third argument. But that's clearly an argument that says, oh, the bad thing about not being just is you miss out on all sorts of good things as a consequence. And the second argument really doesn't tell you what's so good about being just. It just tells you competent judges tell you it's really good. They don't even tell you whether it's good for its own sake or not. So it's only the first argument that does the real heavy lifting here. And really good ways to get out of the argument are to think he's wrong about the nature of justice, or he's wrong about the nature of autonomy or freedom, or he's wrong about the value of autonomy and freedom. But if you think autonomy or freedom is good in itself, and you think, once you understand freedom, it is a matter of settling for yourself what's worth doing and not being led by the strings pulled by the opinions of others or what they're willing to pay or your biology. And you agree justice is a matter of using your reason in this way, then you've got a convincing argument. It's a bunch of ifs there, but I'm sort of flagging the choice points where people reasonably get off. How are we doing on time? Got 5 minutes.
Yeah, we got 5 minutes. So thank you, Jeff. I was going to say, this has been absolutely a great summation. And we have lots of really interesting comments that have been made on our chats, but I want to, many of these have been addressed in either obliquely or directly in your conversation, but let's let some questions come in here.
Please raise your hand. John, do you have a question? Your hand's up.
No, not at this point. Thank you.
Okay. Paul.
Yeah. What would you say to the observation that this is something of an arid prescription or a normative judgment that it's good to be free, and in a way it's an escape from the appetitive, from the constant desire of, of the appetitive nature, but doesn't speak to psychological buy-in and commitment such that Socrates obviously had. There was an investment of the person in this principle. I think there was a passion there, but the way it's described, it seems just like it's just like naming a normative category and saying this is the way to be as a matter of reason and reason only.
So there are a bunch of different ways this can feel and be arid, but mostly in the way I think that abstract ideas are arid, and what you need to do is fill them in. And so I would say, for instance, he does think it's our reason that discovers what's the best thing to do under the circumstances. But when you then ask, how does it do that? And does it do it alone or unaided, to pick up on a word you use? He doesn't actually take a stand on that. If you think about the analogy with the state, it's quite clear, even if the legislators are the ones who figure out what laws to pass, and let's say they figure it out right, that doesn't mean that they've effectively ruled, because that takes the more or less willing compliance of everybody else in the state. So even if it's just the legislators alone who ask and answer the question, what would the best law be? They're not effective at ruling if nobody listens to what they say or pass in their legislature. So the same might be true of us. Reason tells us what's best, but if we don't care about what's best, if we don't have the power to wrestle our desires in the name of honor, guided by spirit that's devoted to reason, we'll just never get beyond the answer to the activity. And he does think the freedom is in the activity. So he does think when you're completely constrained in chains, you aren't free. But it's not because if I took off the chains, you'd then be free. I don't know whether you'd be free till I know how you'd be able to use the lack of chains. So the picture allows this enrichment as you play with the analogies for reason to rule. Does it do that without the willing, more or less willing complicity of spirit and appetite?
Right.
Probably not.
Right.
Similarly, very arid. I keep saying reason asks and answers the question, what would be best under the circumstances? I can hear the question practically shouting, who's to judge what's best? What's the standard of value here? Is it just a social construct or is it something else? And so part of what's going on here is he thinks there's a fact of the matter to the effect that certain things are good and other things are bad. And that some things are good for a person and other things are bad for the person. And we figure out a whole lot of that through experience, if we're competent judges. But a lot of people just never learn from experience, and they never really discover what's good, what's a true enrichment. And we might be so cocky as to confuse ourselves into thinking we always do know and we've always got it right, and there's not an issue here. He thinks that's deeply mistaken. It's not like you can discover what's good, what's the best thing to do, all by your lonesome in a lot of cases. So just as with competent judges, he says one key to being a competent judge is being able to learn through discussion from the experience of others who can learn from their experience. So he doesn't assume, oh, use your reason and you know everything you need. He thinks it's very important. He thinks you've got to be quite mature before you'd possibly be a competent ruler, because there's so much experience that you have to know what has to be modified, what has to be tamped down, what has to be encouraged. And you don't know that by an arid appeal to some principle.
Thank you for that. I'm afraid that I have to be the tyrant here.
Well, what do we rightly do to all tyrants? Shoot them.
This has been just fantastic. I hope you appreciate the pun. I have a few comments. I just want to say a big try again. I hope people have been reading the chat along. I try to intervene with some, when it's appropriate. Abby was always wondering whether it matters that Socrates never wrote a thing, and how can we trust Plato? I think a lot of people always ask that. My answer always is, does it matter? I guess in some ways, but at the same time, it is an interesting point. Lloyd is interested in American individualism and whether those are like America's individualism is completely alien to the socio-political dimension of Plato's ideas about as he says, that would seem alien to Plato's conception of these ideas and practices in a more communitarian or social political dimension. We'll have to answer that question at another time, but I do think it is an absolutely important point. We've had Jonathan, who's just had wonderful comments throughout, bringing in a lot of Talmudic information and helping us square this with rabbinical practice. Again, and Paul and everyone has been just really with wonderful comments. Everyone has been contributing so nicely. I also want to thank, I neglected to mention, of course, Paul Connick is on our advisory board as well, and Jeff Lang. I hope, again, I didn't miss anybody. I wasn't planning on announcing all the members, but once I announced some, I had to announce the others. Jeff, do you have any parting words for our seminar participants?
Remember Vicky too.
Oh, of course. Yeah, well, I got to thank everybody. Vicky is here. I want to thank Paul Bonici. This is hi, Vicky. There you are. This is not the way we normally do these seminars. Jeff was the tyrant and made us do us this way, so we're off our game. But we have learned so much. It's been an absolutely great interactive way. We can actually see hands clapping. So, Jeff, send us off into the night. What are your parting words for us?
Well, I think I would say, as you did, I'm not so interested in whether this was Socrates' view or Plato's view, because it stands or falls on the strength of the ideas in the arguments. It's not, it doesn't derive its power from the authority of its author. There is also about the Republic, huge debate about how much of it was Plato, because it's right in the middle of the corpus. And the normal interpretation is the early Socratic dialogues written by Plato were practically stenographic. And the later dialogues are so clearly not Socratic, they're definitely Plato. And the contrast is, this is all doubts and questions and puzzles, and all I know is how little I know, and post-Republic, it's all positive views. And the Republic is this mix. So it's often held up as probably the transition where more of Plato and less of Socrates got in. I don't have a stand on that at all. The other thing is, I just want to thank everyone for coming. I know it's a slog both to read the stuff and then to spend, from 9:30 to 2:30 of a day of a Saturday. I'm really grateful for your being interested enough to do it. I love talking about this stuff, as you might realize. So thank you for your interest, and I look forward to seeing you at some other seminar.
Absolutely, Jeff, you're always welcome back. I want to remind folks that we have a wonderful programming. Please go to humanities.unc.edu. Blanky suggests that as well. And remember that next Thursday, if you're interested, our music program will be live. It'll be our first live program, our opportunity to do that in, well, you know how long. So we're looking forward to that, and hopefully you will come and join us to hear wonderful Chopin. Robert Buxton is not only a fantastic pianist, but he's also a wonderful explainer of the music and the compositions as well. It should be a wonderful hour of music and live, and I hope we can see some of you there in 3D. Jeff, Sayre-McCord, thank you again for all that you do for knowledge at UNC, and for, in particular, for working so well with Carolina Public Humanities for these now, 35 years or however long you've been working with us. We're so grateful for your collaboration, your collegiality. Vicky, thank you, of course. I want to thank Brian Ensminger for signing everybody up, and Paul Bonici, who has been here in the background helping us out with some of the technological aspects. All of you are great. You contributed so much. I learned almost as much from you as I did from Jeff Sayre-McCord today. So thank you so much for all joining us, and we'll see you next time. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Blanky says bye.
Oh, and look up the PPE Society and the PPE program.
Yes,
Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. At least some of you might find it interesting.
I do. Okay.
Okay, great.
Bye-bye, everybody. Take care.
Bye.